The Witcher 3 takes place in a world called the Northern Kingdoms. Within it, players assume the role of Geralt of Rivia, a witcher or monster hunter. As Geralt, players must track down his adopted ward, Ciri, who's been pursued by a horde of ghastly riders called the Wild Hunt. While completing quests toward this end, players are presented with pivotal ethical situations. No matter the player's actions, though a perfect ending is unattainable. And throughout this video, I will examine the consequences of this impossibility primarily from a player's perspective, though design principles play into the topic as well. Furthermore, I focus on a close hermeneutic reading of the ethics at play in The Witcher 3, based on my own approach to the game as well, as some players, like myself, endeavor to minimize negative outcomes for characters and situations they feel strongly about. Other approaches to and interpretations of the game's ethics are of course possible. That is why I merely want to draw out a specific ethical type in hopes of further uncovering. Because of this common tendency toward positive outcomes, players may prefer endings in which Geralt and Ciri are reunited and reconcile with one another. However, CD Projekt Red restricts players from preserving the life and well-being of every character while progressing through the story. Barring the use of a guide, the right choice in each ethical situation is usually inaccessible, and like in real life, the consequences of each choice are typically deferred, sometimes for hours worth of play in the game world. Inevitably, then players will encounter ethical failure. Moreover, a subset of players will realize that the blindness of their choices led to their inability to set all things right in the Northern Kingdoms. The question a lot of players have is, can a new sense of ethics emerge from such inevitable ethical failure? And like others, I believe such ethics indeed can, because players must make tough choices, and yet, Geralt presents himself as a neutral character, and the players are then caught up in an ethical rhetorical dialectic. And this dialectic is comprised of Geralt's rhetoric of neutrality, embattled with what I refer to as the oriented ethics, embedded in the game's branching narrative. The ethical abstraction produced by this dialectic, I argue, not only encompasses the radical ethics I discuss, but can also highlight to conscientious players the need for and benefits of living out of radical ethics in the real world. Furthermore, I contend that these radical ethics are not only rhetorically implicit in the ethical situations that unfold in the game's dialogue and gameplay, but are also rhetorically effective in its action upon players due to the game's systems of choice making. These systems manifest through procedural rhetoric. This procedural rhetoric is inherent in the rules of the game, which allow and disallow players from performing and receiving symbols. Moreover, it immerses players in an empathic process of gaining experience. This process will quite possibly open up to many players a sense of radical ethics. Few moments in The Witcher 3 exemplify the game's ethical focus more than the Whispering Hillock. This quest presents the player as Geralt, with the choice to either kill or free a vengeful tree spirit that resides in a bog. When players encounter the spirit, they have little information on its motivations, so making the right choice is already a dubious prospect. If the player chooses to kill the spirit, the orphans who also live in the bog will be kidnapped and eaten by the witches who rule the neighboring villages. However, the villagers who killed the spirit's body and imprisoned the spirit in the eponymous The Whispering Hillock will survive. If, on the other hand, the player decides to spare the spirit, it will save the orphans from the witches and instead will slaughter the villagers for revenge. In this scenario, Geralt's Witcher's code functions as a part of his worldview, which determines ontology for him. Broadly speaking, ontology refers to the nature of existence and the multiplicity of worldviews on the subject. In the game, Geralt references his code multiple times to justify avoiding encounters with others, deploying a rhetoric of neutrality. However, because of his duty to Ciri, and because the game mechanics do not allow it, players will find it impossible to remain neutral in their decisions while advancing the main quest's arc. Geralt's rhetoric of neutrality and the ethical demands of CD Projekt Red's gameplay systems here come into contact with one another, forming the dialectic that drives the game's radical ethics. When players encounter the tree spirit in the Whispering Hillock, they initiate the site of their encounter with an assimilable alterity of the other, which provokes an interruption in identification and cognition. Before the spirit even addresses players to inform them of its predicament, they've already engaged it in a pre-symbolic language relation that they are unable to turn away from. This connection through language impels players to make use of their capacity to recognize common exposedness in order to fulfill an ethical responsibility. The ethical demands of this first discourse are also reinforced on the mechanical level of the game. Once the player has begun the dialogue with the spirit, they are literally unable to turn away, as the game's dialogue systems do not allow them to physically leave the scene. Players can only do so once the spirit has finished pleading them to help it escape. Of course, after players have made their choice, they will invariably realize that whatever they chose does not carry with it ideal consequences, as different characters or others die no matter what happens. This no-win situation is thematically in keeping with the ethics of blindness The Witcher 3 seems to cultivate. The game does this by doling out consequences for each choice the player makes in such a way that they are often difficult to anticipate. In the Whispering Hillock quest, the plight of the others is made prominent, and players will eventually realize that there are other characters in the game world whom they cannot satisfactorily help in a single playthrough. To players of The Witcher 3, these characters constitute an unreachable alterity to whom they are considerably obligated due to the game's anticipation of player responsiveness in dialogic moments. But why try to make certain players feel guilty for playing the game the way it was designed? Video games are, after all, designed to be entertaining. Why then would CD Projekt Red remove the possibility of a perfect game world, one in which the player remains at all times in absolute control? At the risk of sounding didactic, I contend that this diminishment of player agency in reaching ideal outcomes attunes players to a sense of radical ethical accountability. This accountability as the acceptance of the fact that we will always fail to give an account of ourselves, and if the identity we say we are cannot possibly capture us, then any effort to give an account of oneself will have to fail in order to approach being true. The Witcher 3's main quests literalize this definition of accountability by forcing upon players mechanics that disallow progression until ethical choices have been made. Typically, players must make these choices by choosing from a lineup of limited dialogue options during pivotal story moments, a process that can only approximate the ambiguity of real-life decision-making due to the resource costs of video game development. However, combined with the game's deferred consequence system that forces players to live with their choices, the limited choices are effective insofar as they draw players toward the understanding that they are not always capable of predicting the consequences of their choices. I did not mean for those villagers to suffer, a player might think, after realizing the impact of their decisions in the Whispering Hillock. Can't I save both them and the orphans? Players cannot, and it is this inevitable failure to self-narrate that makes salient to them the responsibility that they have to interrupt their identification, judgments, and norms. In doing so, many players may assess the alterity of the other, the spirit, and attempt to apprehend what it is that makes it unique. Like actual singular beings in real life, the spirit possesses not only the capacity for evil, but also for good. Employing violence as a means of erasing otherness is antithetical to radical ethics, but this marginality is a site of creativity and power, where we recover ourselves, where we move in solidarity, especially at a location of radical openness and possibility. The term marginality is inextricable from a discussion of otherness, and by proximity, radical ethics, precisely because it contains the power of radical openness that can push past the detached relations of everyday strangers. Yet, players of The Witcher 3 are allowed and often encouraged to employ physical and figurative violence against others, whether it be slaughtering a whole camp of bandits or denying Ciri's agency by making decisions for her. No matter the choices they make, players will still encounter radical failure. The inevitability of this failure has the capacity to drive many players toward the radical ethics embedded in the game. This potential for failure acts rhetorically upon many players, and I believe it can drive them toward a formative understanding and engagement with radical ethics. This is because an ethical dimension explicitly exists in the limited range of choices with which players can respond to other characters. On a mechanical level, CD Projekt Red makes evident the ethical dimensions of the game by limiting what the players can and cannot accomplish in its world. Namely, these limitations originate from the inability and ability to attain desirable ethical outcomes. These mechanical limitations are an example of the concept of procedural rhetoric, which is defined as the practice of using processes persuasively. Since all players of the game engage with its processes in some way, choosing courses of action in dramatic rhetorical scenes causes many players to identify with the digital characters, be it with dislike, affection, or indignation. This is because the design and structure afforded by CD Projekt Red makes the characters appear to be rhetorically responsive. In accordance with The Witcher 3's focus on ethical radicality, the player's anthropomorphizing of the characters as realistic beings enacts a process of taking experience, a process in which we players replace ourselves with the protagonist. This substitution unfolds through an immersive experience that, in this case, constitutes the ontology of play in The Witcher 3. So, in a direct sense, we players become Geralt, but we also realize the extent to which our success and satisfaction is caught up This is the effect of the ethic rhetorical abstraction arising from the game's mechanics at play and thematic content. This process of ethical revelation by the ethic rhetorical dialectic of the game's systems of play is critical from a player perspective. It may not only cultivate a sense of ethical responsibility in many players, but also highlights the growing complexity and maturity of the medium as a whole. It is true that many players still rely on games for the fun factor alone. However, more players than ever before are hungry for games that present them with tough choices, so that they can either reflect on ethical complexities to make the best choices or roleplay as a specific moral alignment as the game allows. Games like The Witcher 3 give many players who carry such expectations something of ethical value to carry over into the real world in discourse, contemplation, and, hopefully, day-to-day living. In response to the assertions in this video, one might say that duty-oriented ethics are more closely aligned with the game's themes. After all, at first glance it appears to mirror Geralt's motivations and characteristics most accurately. Out of the well-known ethical theories, as Ciri's father figure, Geralt frequently expresses that he will do whatever is necessary to find her and ensure her safety. This maxim could be willed for all and become a universal law, thereby fulfilling the requirements of his categorical, imperative and unconditional moral obligation. However, like the obligation of radical ethics, this deontological maxim of seeking out and protecting the other, here Ciri and many other characters, also conflicts with Geralt's self-proclaimed principles of neutrality. Indeed, this contradiction could very well lead some players to superimpose a deontological framework over the game's story and mechanics in an attempt to best fulfill their duty to Ciri. For example, in the Whispering Hill quest, players attempting to follow a deontological ethics might save the villagers over the orphans if they believe that the farmers will have more information on Ciri's whereabouts than the latter. However, this ethical solution is only highlighting the impossibility of living out a deontological ethics. In everyday life, no one has access to the correct series of choices to fulfill one's duty, as only the nature of the video game medium allows us to cheat in this way, because the choices in The Witcher 3 always constitute betrayals of the other. The approach of radicality is perhaps our most productive option. Drawing a conception of ethical radicality from The Witcher 3 can point us as players beyond our own wants and needs, gently stimulating us toward attunement to those of others.